Imagine being handed a country, an army, or a fortune, and somehow returning it on fire. Modern history is packed with men who did exactly that. Not villains, not geniuses, just spectacularly, gloriously wrong. 44 of them lined up in one ride, each a masterclass in how a single bad decision can sink ships, lose wars, and bury empires under their own arrogance. 1. The Titanic received multiple ice warnings throughout April 14, 1912, and somehow the great unsinkable ship kept charging through the dark Atlantic at near top speed. Captain Edward Smith, 30 years at sea and called the Millionaire's captain, was supposed to retire after this voyage. The warning system on board completely failed that night, with messages misrouted, deprioritized, or never properly evaluated. One critical iceberg report from the Mesaba reportedly never even made it from the wireless room up to the bridge. The ship met its iceberg about 20 minutes after the last serious warning slipped through the cracks. Over 1,500 people died in a disaster built from confidence, speed, and broken communication. Smith's retirement party became one of history's most quoted catastrophes. 2. The British Army in Crimea, 1854, handed Lord Cardigan an order so vaguely worded it should have come with a riddle book and a magnifying glass. Attack the guns, it said, without specifying which guns. Cardigan, whose name somehow survived as a cozy knit sweater, eyeballed a long valley packed with Russian cannons on 3 sides and decided that must be the target. Down went the Light Brigade. The cavalry came back shredded. Tennyson wrote a famous poem about the carnage. Cardigan trotted home, ate a hearty meal, and bragged about his ride for years afterward. The sweater happily outlived everyone involved in the decision, including Cardigan's military reputation. 3. 800 enemy warriors, said the intelligence report handed to George Armstrong Custer in June 1876. The actual number waiting near the Little Bighorn was closer to 2,000, but Custer apparently treated that figure as a typo. His response was bold and creative. He split his already small force into 3 neat groups, turned down offered Gatling guns for slowing him down, and brushed aside his Crow Scouts who basically begged him not to attack. The fight that followed was very short and very one-sided. Custer's column never came back. The Scouts, sadly correct from the start, ended up delivering the news to a stunned chain of command. 4. There are bad commanders, and then there is General William Elphinstone, who in January 1842 led the British retreat from Kabul like a man who had misplaced the map and several decades of judgment. 64 years old and crippled with gout, he negotiated safe passage with Afghan tribes who promptly ignored the deal. Roughly 16,000 soldiers and civilians marched into icy mountain passes with poor planning and almost no support waiting on the other side. A battered army surgeon named William Bryden staggered into Jalalabad as the visible survivor of the column. Others survived as prisoners or hostages, eventually released much later. The retreat became the gold standard of how not to leave a country. 5. Sailing 18,000 miles from the Baltic to Japan in 1904 sounds difficult enough without opening the trip by attacking British fishermen. Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky genuinely believed Japanese torpedo boats were hiding among Hull trawlermen off the English coast, several thousand miles from anything remotely Japanese. His Russian fleet opened fire, accidentally hit one of its own cruisers in the chaos, and very nearly dragged Russia into a fresh war with the British Empire. Months later at Tsushima Strait, the Japanese Navy methodically dismantled the entire armada. Rozhestvensky spent part of the disaster wounded and barely in command, which, given the day's results, may have been the small mercy his sailors did not realize they wanted. 6. Promising to feed an entire trapped army by air in Russian winter with cargo planes nobody actually had in sufficient numbers is the kind of pledge most adults would think twice about. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring did not. In late 1942, he assured Hitler the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons of supplies daily to the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad. The real average came in around 100 tons, and only on good weather days, which Russian winter generously offers very few of. Hitler refused a breakout. The 6th Army slowly fell apart inside the freezing pocket. The Eastern Front cracked at the spine, courtesy of one man treating logistics like motivational speaking. 7. Italy invaded Greece in October 1940 because Benito Mussolini wanted his own personal little war for the family scrapbook, and even Hitler had not been told beforehand. 2 weeks, Mussolini cheerfully promised his generals. Easy stroll, lovely weather, back before anyone noticed. The Greek army, equipped with smaller numbers and using donkeys for transport, looked at the invasion and shoved the Italians backward into the snowy mountains of Albania. By spring, Mussolini was begging Hitler to come fix the embarrassment. The Balkan mess pulled German resources around before the invasion of the Soviet Union. Whether it truly changed the fate of Barbarossa is still argued by historians, but it certainly turned one man's vanity into the entire Axis's headache. 8. 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops, the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore, handed over in February 1942 to a Japanese force less than half the size. General Arthur Percival had been warned for years that his fortress was built to stare heroically out to sea, while the back door through Malaya stood wide open. He waved the warnings off, insisting the jungle was impassable. The Japanese promptly passed through it. Their commander Yamashita was nearly out of ammunition and openly bluffing for his life. Percival noticed nothing and surrendered the entire garrison anyway. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. Somewhere on the Japanese side, the bluff of the century just quietly worked. 9. Marching 2,000 redcoats in perfect parade formation through dense Pennsylvania forest in 1755 against an enemy that specialized in trees was never going to age well. General Edward Braddock had been personally warned by a young colonial officer named George Washington that European tactics would simply not function here. Braddock dismissed the colonial advice and kept his polished column moving forward in straight lines. French and native fighters ambushed the formation from cover near the Monongahela River. The redcoats, drilled for tidy European fields, formed neat ranks in the woods and ended up firing into smoke and occasionally each other. Braddock fell. Washington carried the dispatch box home and took the kind of notes that would one day humble an empire. 10. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne marched a British army south from Canada in 1777 with a plan that depended on speed, coordination, and an almost cinematic belief that the wilderness would cooperate. The wilderness firmly disagreed. American militiamen chopped down trees across his route, blocked supply lines, and turned an elegant invasion into a slow-motion starvation tour through the Adirondacks. By the time he reached Saratoga, he was outnumbered, surrounded, and very nearly out of options. His surrender of roughly 6,000 men is exactly what convinced France to enter the war on the American side. One overconfident commander basically handed Paris a written invitation to bankroll a revolution against London. 11. Going to war with Prussia in 1870 over a deliberately edited telegram is impressive enough on its own, but Napoleon III decided to personally lead the army while suffering miserably from kidney stones. The original Napoleon's nephew had inherited the famous name and almost none of the military talent. Bismarck trimmed a routine diplomatic note to sound rude, leaked it to the press, and watched France stomp straight into the trap. 6 weeks later at Sedan, Napoleon was captured along with roughly 100,000 soldiers. The Second Empire collapsed within hours of the news reaching Paris. Bismarck used the wreckage to unify Germany. Somewhere in a quiet crypt, the first Napoleon was reportedly spinning at high speed. 12. Choosing ponies for Antarctica is the kind of decision that should never get past a planning meeting. Yet Robert Falcon Scott built his 1911 South Pole expedition around exactly that idea. Ponies sank into deep snow. Sled dogs would not have. He also brought motorized sledges that broke within days and insisted on man-hauling because Victorian dignity demanded it. Rations were miscalculated down to the gram. When he finally reached the pole in January 1912, he found a small Norwegian flag already there, planted by Roald Amundsen, who had used dogs, skis, and actual polar experience instead of national pride. Scott's plan was less an expedition and more a heroic museum exhibit of fatally Victorian thinking. 13. Taking a long, gentle afternoon nap in the middle of an active military campaign is not standard doctrine, but Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna disagreed enthusiastically. the self-styled Napoleon of the West marched his Mexican army into a swampy field called San Jacinto in April 1836 and decided the troops needed a proper siesta. He failed to post enough sentries. Sam Houston's smaller Texan force walked straight into camp during nap time. The entire battle lasted roughly 18 minutes. Santa Anna was caught the next day wearing a stolen private's uniform until his own soldiers spotted him and saluted, instantly blowing the disguise. Texas got its independence. Santa Anna somehow returned to power 5 more times after this performance. 14. Spears versus rifles. What could possibly go wrong? Was apparently a serious strategic assumption when Lord Chelmsford invaded Zululand in 1879. He pitched his main camp at Isandlwana without circling the wagons, without digging trenches, and without taking the local terrain remotely seriously. Then he rode off with half his army chasing what he thought was the main Zulu force. The actual main Zulu army, around 20,000 warriors, was watching from a hidden valley nearby, calmly picking its moment. They overran the position in a matter of hours. Chelmsford returned to find ruins and immediately began blaming his subordinates, the colonials, the weather, the maps, and possibly the grass itself. 15. Self-destructing your own armada before the enemy even fires is a special kind of stage fright. Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, commanding the combined French and Spanish fleet at Trafalgar in 1805, was utterly terrified of Lord Nelson on a deeply personal level. Ordered by Napoleon to break out and threaten Britain, he dithered, sailed the wrong direction, panicked, and finally ordered his entire battle line to reverse course right as the British were already attacking. His fleet ended up shaped like a confused question mark. Nelson cut straight through it. The British captured or destroyed 18 enemy ships and lost none of their own. Britain went on to rule the seas for the next century. 16. Firing Bismarck, the most effective diplomat in modern German history, was the opening act of Kaiser Wilhelm II's reign, and the rest of the show only got louder. He took the throne in 1888 with no patience, vast ambition, and a personality somewhere between a peacock and a fire alarm. In 1914, he handed Austria-Hungary the now famous blank check, promising German support for whatever action they took against Serbia. He gave baffling interviews to foreign newspapers that horrified his own diplomats. By 1918, his empire was gone. His royal cousins were either dead or exiled, and Wilhelm was quietly chopping wood in a comfortable Dutch retirement. 17. Personally taking command of an army already losing a world war is the kind of move that ends dynasties. Tsar Nicholas II did exactly that in 1915. Leaving the Russian capital to supervise military disasters in real time at the front, he had no real strategic training and no realistic plan. He left his wife and a certain charismatic mystic named Rasputin to manage the government back in Petrograd, which went about as smoothly as you would expect. Russia kept losing. Food and patience ran out. By March 1917, he abdicated. The dynasty collapsed after 300 years, and the country slid straight into revolution. He brought no luck to anyone, including himself. 18. A Scottish gambler with a colorful past somehow convinced the French regent in 1716 to hand him control of the entire national economy. Meet John Law. His grand plan involved printing piles of paper money, founding a national bank, and launching the Mississippi Company, which advertised endless gold reserves in Louisiana. That minor detail did not actually exist. Share prices rocketed from 500 livres to 10,000 in a few delirious months. Then reality showed up wearing a scowl. The bubble exploded in 1720, paper money turned worthless overnight, and France stayed financially bruised for decades. Law fled the country in disguise. The word millionaire was actually coined during his magnificent rocket ride. 19. A company with no real trade routes, no honest assets, and no actual business plan still managed to swallow the personal fortune of Isaac Newton himself. Welcome to the South Sea Bubble of 1720, masterminded by Sir John Blunt. He convinced an entire kingdom to dump savings into stock that climbed from £100 to £1,000 in 8 months, then crashed back down in a matter of weeks. Newton lost what today would buy a small castle and is often said to have sighed that he could calculate the motions of celestial bodies but not the madness of men. Blunt was stripped of his fortune. Parliament nearly fell. Britain's faith in markets needed a very long, very expensive lie-down. 20. A mosquito-infested swamp on the Isthmus of Panama was somehow pitched as Scotland's golden future in 1698. The salesman was William Patterson, who convinced an entire kingdom to invest roughly a quarter of its national wealth in his dream colony at Darien. He had never visited the place. He had no trade routes lined up. He had no permission from Spain, which already claimed the land. The first 1,200 colonists arrived to find disease, hostile officials, and a tropical climate that found them very tasty. 2 follow-up expeditions ended the same way. Scotland went broke. The disaster did not single-handedly end the kingdom, but it handed the pro-Union side exactly the financial argument it needed for 1707. 21. Running a modern army on motorcycle couriers in 1940, while German tank divisions were chatting freely on radios, is the kind of decision that ends countries quickly. General Maurice Gamelin, supreme commander of the French army, worked from a quiet chateau outside Paris with a command setup so allergic to speed that dispatch riders still mattered more than wires. When the Wehrmacht broke through at Sedan, his system simply could not keep up with the news. By the time orders adjusted, German armor was already sprinting toward the English Channel. The French army, on paper one of the strongest in the world, folded in 6 weeks. The Maginot Line stood untouched and useless, watching the entire collapse from the side. 22. Picking simultaneous fights with Napoleon and Russia, with no real allies and a fragile army, is the kind of foreign policy that quietly closes a dynasty. Welcome to the reign of King Gustav IV of Sweden in the early 1800s. He also personally believed that Napoleon was the literal beast from the Book of Revelation, which is an unusual position for a head of state to bring to cabinet meetings. Russia invaded Finland in 1808 and kept it, ending 600 years of Swedish rule almost overnight. Gustav was overthrown in a military coup in 1809 and exiled. He spent his final years wandering Europe broke and using fake names. Sweden has carefully avoided major wars ever since. 23. Ordering roughly 12,000 men to march across open ground directly toward Union artillery in broad daylight sounded perfectly reasonable to Robert E. Lee on July 3, 1863. His own General Longstreet had begged him to call it off, pointing out that the field was a death trap painted in shades of obvious. Lee insisted. The Confederate columns advanced beautifully and were torn apart by cannon and rifle fire before they could close the distance. The charge collapsed within an hour. Gettysburg slipped away. The Confederacy never again mounted an offensive with the same strategic promise. Lee himself reportedly muttered that the whole fault was his alone, which is rare honesty for a general in that situation. 24. Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy received one simple job from Napoleon on the morning of Waterloo, June 18, 1815. Take 33,000 troops, chase the Prussians under Blücher, and keep them off the main battle. He followed the Prussians too rigidly and failed to adjust when the real battle announced itself in cannon fire. His officers, especially General Gérard, begged him to march toward the sound of the guns. Grouchy refused, citing his original orders like a man reading a receipt. The Prussians slipped around him and smashed into Napoleon's right flank by evening. France lost an empire that afternoon. Grouchy spent the rest of his life writing pamphlets explaining it was not his fault. 25. General Karl Mack let Napoleon march an entire army around his position and trap him against a river without firing a serious shot, which is a remarkable trick when you think about it. The Austrian commander dug in confidently at Ulm in October 1805, brushed past multiple signs that French forces were sweeping behind him, and discovered far too late that he was completely surrounded. He surrendered roughly 23,000 troops with barely a real battle to show for it. Napoleon essentially picked him up without bruising the wrapping paper. Mack was court-martialed, stripped of rank, and quietly removed from the kind of textbooks his career would have preferred to appear in. 26. Charles XII of Sweden marched his army deep into Russia in 1708 with winter approaching, no proper supply line, and a personal belief that nothing could possibly stop him. Russian winter promptly stopped quite a lot of him. By the time he reached Poltava in summer 1709, his troops were sick, exhausted, and outnumbered nearly 2-1 by Peter the Great's forces. Charles attacked anyway, while himself nursing a serious foot wound that prevented him from leading on horseback. The Swedish army was crushed. Charles fled south into Ottoman territory and stayed there for years on someone else's couch. Sweden's century as a great European power effectively ended that afternoon. 27. Marshal François Bazaine ended up sealed inside Metz with a massive French army in 1870 and then turned hesitation into a military philosophy. Roughly 140,000 troops sat under his command, still organized, still capable of breaking out, while Prussian forces tightened the noose. He launched half-hearted attempts, abandoned them, negotiated, hesitated again, and finally surrendered one of the largest French field forces in modern history without a serious final battle. The Franco-Prussian War effectively ended right there. He was later court-martialed for treason, sentenced to death, then conveniently escaped prison and lived out his days in exile in Spain. 28. Field Marshal Conrad von Hötzendorf spent years demanding a preventive war with Serbia, then Italy, then Russia, then anyone within shouting distance as Chief of Staff of Austria-Hungary. He got his wish in 1914 and immediately demonstrated why pacifism is sometimes underrated. His grand opening offensives against Serbia were repulsed by a smaller army. His invasion of Russia in Galicia turned into a catastrophe that wrecked the Habsburg Professional Officer Corps within months. He blamed everyone except himself, of course. By 1916, Austria-Hungary was a junior partner clinging to Germany for life support. Conrad, meanwhile, spent a remarkable portion of the war writing romantic letters to his much younger girlfriend. 29. 11 separate offensives along the same Italian river, with similar plans and similar results, defined the tenure of General Luigi Cadorna in the First World War. He sent waves of Italian soldiers up the Isonzo Valley against entrenched Austro-Hungarian positions, achieved very little, and blamed his own men for any failure. He punished alleged deserters by the dozens to encourage morale, which is famously not how morale works. In October 1917, the Austrians, reinforced by German troops, finally counterattacked at Caporetto, and the Italian line collapsed almost overnight. Roughly 300,000 soldiers were captured. Cadorna was finally removed from command, blaming the soldiers one last time on his way out. 30. Sir John Franklin sailed into the Arctic in 1845 with 2 ships full of fine china, sheet music, and crates of inadequately preserved canned food, setting out to chart the Northwest Passage with the elegance of a country house weekend. The whole expedition vanished. Both HMS Erebus and HMS Terror became locked in ice. The crews tried to walk out across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness, dragging heavy lifeboats loaded with completely useless ceremonial gear. All 129 men were lost. Search parties spent decades piecing together fragments of the disaster. The British naval establishment had quietly assumed that good manners and good silver would somehow handle the Arctic. The Arctic firmly disagreed. 31. Joseph Stalin ignored warning after warning from spies, foreign governments, defectors, and his own officers that Hitler was preparing to invade in 1941. Churchill personally signaled him. Defectors literally walked across the border to deliver the news in person. Stalin called them provocateurs and went right back to dismissing everything. When the invasion began on June 22, 1941, Soviet forces in many sectors had explicit orders not to return fire, in case it was a misunderstanding. The opening weeks were a catastrophe, largely manufactured by one man's stubbornness. Later accounts claimed Stalin retreated to his dacha for days afterward, apparently waiting for his own colleagues to arrest him. 32. Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich in September 1938, waving a piece of paper signed by Adolf Hitler, announcing peace for our time to cheering crowds at the airport. Hitler had promised the Sudetenland was his final territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain chose to believe the agreement could buy peace, or at least buy time. Hitler treated it as a receipt. 6 months later, German troops marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway, and the famous piece of paper turned out to be worth slightly less than the ink it was printed in. Britain had given away a major democratic ally, a mountain defense line, and the second largest arms industry in Central Europe. 33. Anthony Eden secretly colluded with France and Israel in 1956 to invade Egypt while lying about it to Britain's closest ally, the United States. It is an extraordinary way to end your career and your empire on the same Tuesday. The operation aimed at retaking the Suez Canal after Egypt's President Nasser nationalized it. Militarily, the assault worked. Diplomatically, it imploded almost instantly. Eisenhower was furious. The pound nearly collapsed. The United Nations demanded withdrawal. Britain backed down humiliated. France resented the betrayal, and Eden resigned within weeks, citing health. The whole affair confirmed in public what had already been quietly true behind closed doors. 34. Louis XVI attempted to flee revolutionary Paris in June 1791, disguised as a servant in a slow carriage stuffed with the entire royal family, jewelry, and a personal silver dinner service. That is not how you sneak out of town. He managed all of it anyway. The carriage was identified at the small town of Varennes, partly because a local postmaster recognized his face, possibly from a portrait on a paper banknote. The king was hauled back to Paris under guard, having confirmed every revolutionary suspicion that he wanted to escape and return with foreign armies behind him. Trust in the monarchy collapsed overnight. One slow carriage rewrote a 1,000-year throne. 35. King James II tried to ram Catholicism through a deeply Protestant England in the 1680s, while also dissolving Parliament and packing the courts with friends. He somehow managed to unite every faction in the country against him in roughly 3 years, which is genuinely impressive in a competitive field. When William of Orange landed with a small Dutch army in November 1688, almost nobody fought for the king. James panicked, dropped the Great Seal of the realm into the Thames on his way out, and fled to France. The Glorious Revolution settled the whole thing without serious bloodshed in England itself. He spent the rest of his life sulking in Paris and writing pamphlets about how unfair the universe was. 36. Archduke Maximilian of Austria accepted an offer from Napoleon III in 1864 to become Emperor of Mexico, a country he had never visited and that did not particularly want a foreign emperor. He sincerely believed Mexicans had voted for him through a rigged plebiscite arranged by French troops, which is the historical equivalent of finding a yes inside a fortune cookie. He sailed across the Atlantic with European court etiquette manuals, expecting to civilize the place. Benito Juárez and the Mexican Republican forces firmly disagreed. When France withdrew its army in 1866, Maximilian refused to leave, certain he was loved. He was captured in 1867 and executed by the republic he had tried to replace. 37. Tsar. Peter III worshipped Russia's most recent military enemy so completely that he made it his founding policy in 1762. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia and immediately handed back hard-won Russian conquests, signed a peace treaty on absurdly generous terms, and started reshaping his army on Prussian lines, complete with new uniforms. He insulted the Orthodox Church. He insulted the Russian Guards. He insulted his own wife, the future Catherine the Great, who quietly counted her options and the loyalties around her. Within 6 months, she led a coup. He abdicated, was placed under arrest, and died shortly afterward under famously murky circumstances. Catherine then ruled for 34 extremely productive years. 38. King George III treated the American colonies as a personal estate that simply needed firmer management. When Parliament floated softer compromises, he pushed against them. When ministers warned the war was unwinnable, he wanted it continued. He saw colonial grievances as insults to be answered rather than political problems to be solved. He sent army after army across the Atlantic to be exhausted, defeated, or surrendered into the history books. By the time peace was signed in 1783, Britain had lost its most valuable colonies, much of its prestige, and a war it could have avoided through 3 different reasonable settlements proposed at 3 different reasonable moments. 39. Captain William Bligh was a brilliant navigator and a catastrophic manager of people. His long Pacific voyage in 1789 on HMS Bounty involved anchoring for months in Tahiti, where his crew suddenly discovered that paradise also existed as an alternative employer. Mutinies are born in conditions like these. Fletcher Christian and roughly half the crew turned on him near Tonga and set him adrift in an open boat with 18 loyal men. Bligh then sailed that tiny vessel nearly 4,000 miles to safety in one of history's greatest feats of navigation. Then he was given a colonial post in Australia. Then another revolt happened. The man was statistically allergic to keeping subordinates calm. 40. Maximilien Robespierre helped build a political machine where suspicion could become a death sentence. It works beautifully until people realize that suspicion can also visit the architect. He ran the Reign of Terror in France through most of 1793 and 1794, presenting himself as the incorruptible voice of virtue and discarding former friends, allies, and rivals one after another. Then he started giving long, vague speeches about further enemies of the Republic without naming names, which finally terrified the entire National Convention into a single self-defensive conclusion. He went next. Within 24 hours, he was arrested and condemned by the very machinery he had perfected. 41. Nearly starting a war between the United States and the British Empire over a single dead pig is one of the more absurd entries in diplomatic history. In June 1859, on San Juan Island in the Pacific Northwest, an American farmer shot an Irish-owned pig belonging to the Hudson's Bay Company because the pig kept eating his potatoes. Local British officials demanded the farmer face arrest. American officials sent troops instead. The British sent warships. Soon, both sides were staring at each other with cannons over one buried pig. Cooler heads in London and Washington intervened before anyone actually fired. The dispute was eventually settled by arbitration in 1872. The pig remains the only confirmed casualty. 42. Convincing an entire nation that a flower bulb is worth the same as a comfortable house is a level of marketing that should embarrass everyone involved. Yet the Dutch in the 1630s gave it a serious attempt. Tulip futures changed hands at staggering prices through 1636, with single rare bulbs reportedly trading for the equivalent of a fine townhouse on an Amsterdam canal. The whole market collapsed in February 1637 when buyers simply failed to show up at one routine auction. Word spread. Prices crashed within days. Many fortunes were paper to begin with, so the human damage was lighter than the legend suggests. But the lesson stuck. Smart people will pay almost anything when the room agrees it makes sense. 43. The real stupidity at the heart of the 1898 Spanish naval disaster was sitting in Madrid, not on the bridge of a warship. Spanish politicians ordered Admiral Pascual Cervera to sail a fleet of obsolete cruisers across the Atlantic to defend Cuba after he had already explained, repeatedly and in writing, that the ships lacked coal, ammunition, and any realistic chance against the modern American Navy. Madrid told him to sail anyway. He was bottled up in Santiago Harbor, ordered to break out, and watched his entire squadron be destroyed in about 4 hours on July 3rd. Spain lost the war and the remnants of its overseas empire shortly afterward. 44. King Charles I believed his authority came directly from God, and that Parliament was therefore an optional nuisance he could dismiss whenever he felt inconvenienced. He spent his reign demonstrating exactly that theory in practice. He dissolved Parliament repeatedly, taxed the country through clever legal tricks, picked fights with Scotland over religion, and then needed Parliament's money to clean up the mess. When civil war broke out in 1642, he refused every reasonable settlement and even secretly invited foreign troops into the conflict. The New Model Army eventually captured him. He was tried, found guilty of tyranny, and lost his throne, his life, and temporarily the monarchy itself in 1649. 44 men, 44 catastrophes, every single one avoidable on a calmer Tuesday. Now the real question: who is the giant, obvious idiot we somehow forgot? Drop the name below and tell us why he belongs higher than everyone on this list. The best answer might headline the next video. Smash that like, hit subscribe so the next ride finds you first, and we will see you in the comments.